Good morning. Welcome to worship. My wife has been on the injured reserve list lately, and out of sheer empathy, I decided to sprain my ankle this last week. So if I'm looking like I'm hobbling just a little bit, I'm trying not to, but yesterday I was walking with a cane. And this morning I got up and my ankle felt much better. And my wife lovingly said, "And I bought you a cane!"
What a waste of money.
Don't worry, it'll come.
Oh, and I'm so glad your leg is healing. I think that's what she meant, but okay. Good to be with you all. I was scrolling through Facebook and I saw a post about a sermon that was delivered at a festival called the Wild Goose Festival. I don't know if any of you have heard of the Wild Goose Festival, but it's for kind of Christian Bible nerds. They have this festival. It's kind of a bunch of like hippies, actually. And they go and they descend on some campsite place and they do all this. And I've known some people who've gone. And there's a woman named Diana Butler Bass. And she has become very famous. But before she was famous, I had lunch with her years ago, and I didn't even know who she was. It was at a continuing ed event, and I just happened to be sitting across the table, and she started telling me about some research she was doing that I was kind of interested in. She's a researcher, and now she is headlining the Wild Goose Festival. And she gave a sermon that so inspired me, I changed what I'm preaching about today. We'll get to that in a little bit. So I had Mike change the scripture, so you don't need the one that's in the bulletin, but the one that comes right after it. So let us stand and join in our call to worship. You may be seated. So I mentioned I sat in bed and read this sermon that she gave to close the Wild Goose Festival. And she talked about a friend of hers who really wanted to know more about the New Testament. So she went to the seminary in her town and said, "I'd really like to know more about the Bible." And they said, "Well, you could get a master's degree." She already had a bachelor's in biblical studies. And so she did. She started that, and part of her work on her dissertation, she came across a verse that she really wanted to study, and it was the verse about Mary and Martha. And what she discovered, because her teacher said, I can show you a picture of the original codex tablet that has this scripture on it. Now that they have decided that everyone could see this, and they've put these things online, sort of protected, so that you have to have some sort of seminary credentials. She went in and she was looking at this verse, and she noticed something that nobody has noticed. All of the really highfalutin Bible scholars who've been doing this their whole lives, here this person who doesn't even have a degree yet went in, and she was noticing that in the original text, instead of saying Mary and Martha, it says Mary and Mary. Now, Mary in Hebrew is Maria, so it's Maria, and Martha is Martha. But in Greek, the symbol for the TH sound, which is a theta, is one letter, and the iota is the same letter with an iota is like an I, and a theta is an I with a circle around it. So you see how close these are. And she noticed that, and all of a sudden, this verse started to make a lot more sense. And Harvard Review wanted to use her dissertation in their publication. Never heard of before. someone looking at Scripture with fresh eyes came up with a different conclusion. And that got me thinking a little bit. And so I was thinking about my sermon, and I said, I don't want to preach on this. But last Tuesday at Lectio Divina, one of our teenagers at St. Mark who comes, she was reading the Scripture and she read too far. And I didn't want to interrupt her because she was really doing it good. And so these are the two verses that follow what I was going to preach on. And I realized as soon as she said it, this is what I want to preach on. Okay? That's why it's different than in your bulletin. So, our scripture for today. Therefore, my beloved, just as you have always obeyed me, who is Paul, not only in my presence, but much more in my absence, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. All right. I remember hearing this verse as a kid. And the way it was explained to me is that you need to work like it's all up to you, and you need to pray like it's all up to God. Anyone heard that? Maybe it was just a little Bible camp that I went to. But this verse used to make me nervous. Like, work out your own salvation in fear and trembling. So I decided to do a little bit of my own research. So I went into the concordance on my phone, and I typed in salvation. And 144 times in the Bible, the word salvation is used. 100 in the Old Testament, and 44 are in the New Testament. Which surprised me because, from what I have heard, salvation is sort of a recent thing. So if you went back and you read, which I did, all of the places that it talked about salvation, they all talk about one of two things. They talk about deliverance from enemies. There was a lot of enemies of the Jews, different neighboring conquerors, and so they were always asking God to deliver them. And part of the fabric of their story is that Moses came and delivered them out of the hand of slavery in Egypt. And that was perceived as salvation. Most of the time when salvation is brought up in the Old Testament, it has to do with deliverance. The other big theme is that it has to do with healing. The root word for salvation in Latin is the same root word for salve, right? S-A-L-V-E. You ever have that when you were a kid before medicine? You got to cut on your arm. We'll put some salve on there. I was out in the woods with my grandfather, and he was chainsawing trees down for making wood, and I would pick up the branches and haul them over to a pile. And he accidentally cut his arm with the chainsaw, kicked back, and it was bleeding. And so he went over to a pine tree with his knife, and he stabbed one of those sap bubbles, and he just stuck it right on there. And he said, it's just like salve. I didn't know what salve was. But it hardened, and it kept his arm from bleeding, and he started the chainsaw back up, and away he went. You ever got sap on your arm in the woods? This doesn't come off too easy, right? It's actually, and whatever was antibacterial as well. They maybe knew more than we know now. But salve and salvation come from the same word. And the meaning is healing or wholeness. So then I thought, well, let's look at the New Testament. And I started reading the places where salvation occurs. And in 41 places, it either was a quotation from the Old Testament, which we've already gone through, or it was about healing and wholeness. In 3 places, it talked about eternal salvation from sin. Okay? 3 places. And I went and looked at those 3 places, and all 3 of them have little scholarly notes that say this section was added at a later date. So only once in the Gospels does it have this idea of eternal salvation in the Gospel of Mark, and it was added much later, probably in the 2nd century. That seems a little disconcerting, doesn't it? The other two places, one is the book of Timothy. And the book of Timothy was one of the last books in the New Testament written. And the other one was the book of Hebrews. And Hebrews is the only book in the New Testament that nobody knows who wrote it. For a long time, in my confirmation days, we believed Paul wrote the book of Hebrews. But now that they can look at the original text, what they've realized is there are 150 different words or word forms that appear in the book of Hebrews that don't appear in any of Paul's other writings. So either he forgot who he was when he wrote Hebrews, or it was written by somebody else. And in the book of Hebrews, because I had to read it just to make sure, it quotes Jesus as saying, "I have come to abolish the law." But those of you who are biblical scholars know that Jesus said, "I did not come to abolish the law, I came to fulfill the law." What do you do with that? So the only 3 places that it talks about salvation in an afterlife context, I think Jesus never would have said. I think there was so much confusion at the time of the death of Jesus. And people were trying to make sense of it. Like when a tragedy happens, we are all trying to figure out who's to blame or why did it happen. And so as the church went on and on and on in history, more and more they started to settle on this idea that the reason Jesus died, was crucified, had some sort of a sacrificial benefit to us. Must have. Otherwise, why would it happen? They totally missed what Jesus did and said in his life, and they changed the meaning of his death to something that benefits us. That's very convenient. So what about this verse? Can you put that back up there, Michael? Because this verse says that we're supposed to work out our salvation in fear and trembling. Well, what if we change the word salvation to healing and wholeness? Let's try that. Therefore, my beloved, just as you have always obeyed me, not only in my presence, but much more now in my absence, work out your own healing or wholeness with fear and trembling. Now, this makes sense to me. I used to work with people who were in AA. When I was a youth minister, I led a group of teens who did AA, and one of the things that they tell you when you get to a certain point in this is that you have to take a fearless moral inventory. They sometimes call it the white knuckle canoe ride, where you have to go back and look at all the places in your life where you have been hurt, and to see how those hurts translated into your destructive behavior, both toward yourself and to others. It's a very fear and trembling kind of experience. I believe that Paul was trying to convey that for us to be useful to God, we have to get rid of our own baggage that we're carrying. We have to go backwards and look at the places that we've been hurt. I'll give you an example. When I was 6 or 7 on the playground, there was a kid named Will. Don't know his last name, but we got in a fight. We were playing soccer or something, and I'm sure he tripped me, or maybe I tripped him. Who knows? We don't need to cast blame. But all of a sudden, we started wrestling, and then we started throwing punches. And he caught me right in the nose, and all of a sudden, blood just started pouring out. And it did something, and all of a sudden, I just could not stop crying. And everybody came around on the playground and started saying, cry baby, you're a little cry baby. And I decided on that very day, I will never cry in public again, which didn't really work out for me, right? Until I went back into that experience in my life and decided that I was going to forgive Will. And not just Will, but the people who probably were acting out of their own hurt, right? Because if we have been hurt, it's easy to hurt someone else. And so we need to go back into our lives and think about the places that we've been hurt. My parents were shopping one time and they lost track of me in the mall. It was a terrifying experience. I was 4, maybe 3 or 4. I had to go back and realize that life is not one big shopping mall where your parents are going to leave you. In order for me to be able to love others openly without fear, I had to deal with my fears. And I probably wouldn't have been able to do that. But since I met Sharon, she is so good at loving me in the midst of all of my stuff that I've been able to just set it down. Set this down, set that down. And I've become so much happier and so much more useful. So in this series on open and relational theology, one of the things about it is that salvation is not about something that happens when you die. And I don't know what happens when you die. I'd hate to say what happens because I don't know. I think it's probably something really great. But salvation is about being healed and wholeness for all the things in our lives that keep us penned in, keep us from loving, from reaching out, from sharing who we are and what God has made us. In our creed we say, God lives in us and through us. God works in us and through us. And I would also add on us. Right? This is kind of what the process, the white knuckle canoe ride is that God is continually calling us to health and wholeness, to set down the things that keep us, all of the past hurts and grief, to work through it. And then we become really useful and happy. Do I seem happier than I